Hello, friends. We often think we know history, but behind the grand portraits and dry dates in textbooks lie stories that give us chills. Honestly, the world is far more bizarre than we've been told. Today, you will learn how ordinary cats managed to halt a great army and topple an ancient empire, becoming a living shield in the hands of a cunning king. You'll also hear about a quiet hero of the diving world who spent 6 years in complete pitch-black darkness, carrying a massive cathedral on his shoulders, saving it from sinking into the swamp. Lastly, we'll discuss a ghostly voice from the past that has made its way to us through 150 years, preserved only as a faint scratch on a layer of ordinary lamp soot. Before we dive in, please like this video and leave a comment. It truly helps the channel to grow. And now, let's get started. Story number 1. The campaign under the banner of meowing gods. Imagine the heat. 525 years before our era. The sand grinds between your teeth, and the air is so thick it feels like you could slice it with a sword. Egypt is a great power that has existed for thousands of years. The pyramids were already ancient by then. Pharaoh Psamtik II is seated in his palace in Memphis, thinking he's completely secure. And why wouldn't he be? He possesses a massive army, including Greek mercenaries. Most importantly, the gods are at his back. The Egyptians at that time were, let's say, very devout people, but their faith was different from what we see today. It was a blend of reverence and sacred fear of nature, and at the center of this worship were cats. You see, in Egypt, a cat was not merely a household pet that knocked vases off shelves. It was the embodiment of the goddess Bastet. The punishment for killing a cat, even inadvertently, could lead to one being stoned on the spot. A crowd would tear them apart without a trial or investigation. And here comes the Persian king Cambyses II to the borders of this land. You know, the typical conqueror of that era, ambitious, ruthless, and, as it turns out, incredibly cunning. He arrived at the city of Pelusium, which was effectively the key to Egypt. Storming the city head-on was nearly impossible. The walls were high, the defenders experienced, and the Persians had attempted to attack multiple times only to be showered with arrows by the Egyptians. Cambyses observed this, wiped the sand from his face, and realized he needed a new approach. To be honest, any other general would have simply laid siege for years. But Cambyses, it seems, was quite adept at understanding the psychology of his opponent. Perhaps someone advised him? He ordered his troops to capture cats. Yes, you heard that right. Soldiers from the greatest army of the time ran around the surroundings with nets and baskets, collecting every stray cat they could find. Think that's all? No, that was just the first step of his insane plan. Imagine the morning before the decisive assault. Egyptian archers stand on the walls, ready to unleash a storm of arrows. They see the Persian army beginning to advance, but something feels off. Something strange glimmers among the enemy ranks. As the Persians drew nearer, the Egyptians were left literally dumbfounded. Cambyses ordered each of his warriors at the front of the column to tie a live cat to their shield, or, according to some accounts, to simply draw their likenesses, but they were still required to carry the actual animals in their arms. This was a shock, a true psychological collapse. Imagine yourself in the position of that archer. You need to shoot, but right in front of you stands your god. To release an arrow at a Persian would mean killing a sacred being, committing an act of sacrilege that would doom your soul to eternal torment and invite the wrath of Bastet upon your country. The Persians marched slowly, step by step. The silence on the walls was deafening. The only sound breaking the chilling dread was the meowing of hundreds of frightened cats. Not a single Egyptian arrow took flight. The archers simply lowered their arms. They wept, they prayed, but they could not shoot. The Persians entered the city with virtually no resistance. Ancient, powerful Egypt fell not because the enemy had better swords or more soldiers. It fell because one man understood that faith can be both the greatest strength and the most vulnerable point. Cambyses II seized the throne of the pharaohs with the aid of a fluffy living shield. And you know what's most ironic? The Persians didn't particularly love cats. For them, it was merely a fortunate find, a tool. After this battle, Egypt would never be the same. It became a part of another empire. And the cats? I suppose they just continued to regard humans with the same enigmatic disdain as they do today, as if they know they once decided the fate of an entire kingdom. But if you think that manipulation of faith and fear is the limit of human imagination, just wait. In the next tale, we will journey to a place where people tried to deceive not the gods, but death itself, using an ordinary musical instrument. Story number 2, The Curse of the Silk Sleeve. Listen, have you ever felt that an item just doesn't belong to you? It happens, right? You buy a jacket and it feels like it's weighing down your shoulders. Well, in the mid-15th century in Japan, one such item didn't just weigh down, it literally reduced one of the largest cities in the world to ash. Picture Edo, that's the old name for Tokyo, in January. The city was under a dreadful drought. Rain hadn't fallen in ages. The wooden houses, tightly packed together, turned into perfect kindling just waiting for a spark. Amidst this dusty, parched land lived a young girl, the daughter of a wealthy merchant. She was hopelessly in love, of course. Her chosen one was a young monk who didn't even glance her way. The poor girl suffered so much that she ordered a magnificent kimono made from heavy purple silk. Cherry blossoms were embroidered on the sleeves of the furisode. She hoped that in this attire he would notice her. He didn't. She withered away from despair and passed away without ever wearing it. Sad, isn't it? Yes, but that's just the beginning. According to the custom of that time, the kimono was sold. It was bought by another girl. And guess what? A few months later, she suddenly fell ill and died. The kimono was resold again, a third owner, and again, death, literally within a week. Imagine the horror of the people. Rumors spread through the narrow streets of Edo faster than rats. The locals referred to it as the kimono killer. Eventually, a priest from one of the temples declared, "Enough. This silk is cursed. It must be burned to break the chain of deaths." On the 2nd of March, 1657, a bonfire was lit in the temple courtyard. A crowd gathered, all eager to witness the flames consume the ominous fabric. The priest cast the kimono into the fire, and at that moment, reality took a turn for the horrific. Just as the silk ignited, a sudden and wild gust of northern wind blew in. It carried such force that it lifted the burning kimono out of the flames and sent it soaring high into the sky. Imagine this scene. A massive, blazing, purple specter soaring above the city, scattering sparks. The kimono fell onto the temple roof. The temple ignited like a match. And then, hell broke loose. The wind spread the flames, leaping from one thatched roof to another. The fire raged through the city for 3 days. 3 long days. People fled to the river, but the bridges collapsed under the weight of the crowd. More than 100,000 lives were lost. 60% of Edo turned into a black wasteland. Even the shogun's castle was consumed. All because of one unfortunate piece of silk that merely craved love. Historians still debate whether this was a curse or just a catastrophic coincidence. But since then, the conflagration has been referred to as the Great Furisode Fire, named after the very kimono with long sleeves. By the way, if you believe that after such an event the Japanese ceased to trust in mysticism, you don't know them very well. They merely became more cautious with gifts. However, while the fire in this account was spontaneous and accidental, in the next chapter, we will discuss a man who sought to tame another element. And no, it's not electricity. This was the strangest form of travel ever seen in Europe. A man who literally decided to ride the silence. History number 3. An elephant on thin ice. You know, we tend to think of nature as something stable. Well, give or take. Summers are hot, winters bring snow, and rivers simply flow. But imagine for a moment that the main waterway of a vast city, the mighty, salty, and temperamental Thames, suddenly fell silent, just stopped, turning to stone. Honestly, this sounds absurd today, global warming and all that, but in the 15th century, London was different. The world was gripped by the Little Ice Age. The cold was so harsh that birds froze mid-flight, and the Thames froze so deeply that the ice became more reliable than the English pound. Now picture this. A year, January. The Londoners awaken to find their river has vanished. Instead, there lies an endless white expanse. And what do these crazy Brits do? They don't stay inside with tea? No, they venture out onto the ice. Thousands of people. It was like some surreal dream. In the middle of the river, where ships usually sailed, entire streets of tents sprouted up. Frost fairs, can you imagine? Taverns, souvenir shops, barber shops. They even set up a printing press right there on the ice, printing newspapers and flyers that stated, "Printed on the Thames." Fashionable, stylish, quite bizarre. Listen, they even roasted entire bulls on spits. Fires were burning right in the middle of the river. The ice didn't even crack. And as a highlight of this madness, there was an elephant. Yes, you heard that right. A genuine, enormous elephant. It was guided across the ice from one bank to the other. The crowd screamed with excitement. The massive creature stomped on the ice where boats had floated just a week prior. Was this the triumph of humanity over nature, or merely collective madness? Who can say? However, wait a second. There was one very significant detail. At that time, the old London Bridge was structured in such a way that its supports acted like a dam. They slowed the current, allowing the ice to solidify. People believed this would always be the case, that the Thames was their eternal icy arena. But that year, everything changed. Fog, a sudden warming. The ice began to crack with a thunderous noise, as if cannons were being fired. Stalls, tents, goods, everything was swept out to sea. People barely managed to escape. Then the bridge was reconstructed. The current became swift. The river would never freeze as deeply again. Those fairs remain in history as a symbol of an era when people could throw a feast at the bottom, well, nearly at the bottom, of the river. The memory of the elephant walking on the water still seems somewhat hallucinatory. By the way, do you know what's most amusing? While some were roasting bulls on the frozen Thames, others attempted the impossible in complete darkness underground. But there, they were met not by ice, but by something far more terrifying. A tale of a place that officially did not exist, yet changed the course of history. Story number 4. The 10-foot sleeping giant from New York. Do you believe in miracles? No, I'm not talking about the ones from books. I mean the kind you can touch. The ones that smell of antiquity and make your heart race somewhere near your throat. Honestly, people in the 19th century were, well, they were eager to believe. They longed for fantasy in a world that was becoming filled with factory smoke and dull accountant figures. Imagine this. On October 16, 1869, at William Newell's quiet farm in Cardiff, New York. A typical morning, foggy. 2 workers were digging a well behind the barn. Routine, laborious work. The shovel hit something hard. Probably a rock. They dug deeper. Suddenly, one of them shouted, "A human foot has emerged from the ground, but what a foot! It was simply enormous. Picture a foot nearly 2 feet in length. The workers, holding their breath, began to clear the earth with their hands, and after a couple of hours, the world saw him. Peering out from the pit was a giant, the 10-foot stone man. Weighing 300 pounds, with a serene expression, his hand resting on his belly. He looked as if he had merely lain down for a nap a couple of thousand years ago. The news spread like wildfire. The Cardiff giant, an ancient colossus, a biblical hero. People went insane. Although wait, it wasn't just madness. It was an epidemic. Farmer Newell quickly realized that he no longer needed the well. But a tent over the hole? That was very much needed. He began charging 50 cents for admission, a fortune for those times. Thousands of individuals were traveling by train, walking on foot, and sleeping in haystacks just to catch a glimpse of the petrified prophet. Scientists? That was the most amusing part. While some claimed it was an ancient statue, others, serious men in glasses, were earnestly asserting that this was a genuine human being turned into stone. "Look at these pores on the skin," they shouted. "Observe the veins!" The crowd rejoiced. Everyone wanted to believe that once, gods walked on their land. However, every good story has layers beneath the surface. While the masses wept over the giant, one man in Chicago quietly chuckled into his bushy mustache. His name was George Hull. He was a tobacconist and, frankly, the greatest troll of his era. A year prior, he had debated with a clergyman about whether giants ever roamed the earth. Hull was an atheist and sought to demonstrate just how easily a believer could be deceived. He secretly purchased a massive block of plaster, hired sculptors, and instructed them to carve a giant and treat it with acid to give the stone an aged appearance. They even pierced the skin with needles to create the effect of pores. Then, the giant was transported and buried on his cousin Newell's farm. He waited an entire year. A whole year for the god to mature beneath the earth. Do you think that when the hoax was revealed, people were upset? Quite the contrary. This is the strangest part. When the famous showman P.T. Barnum, yes, the one who has films made about him, discovered that the giant was a fake, he offered to buy it. When he was turned down, he simply made his own replica of the giant and claimed that his was the real one, while Newell's was the counterfeit. Imagine that absurdity. Lines formed for the counterfeit of a counterfeit. People debated hoarsely about whose false giant was more authentic. It was a victory of imagination over reality, complete and unreserved. Ultimately, Hull confessed to everything, yet this did not halt the flow of money. The giant became a symbol of how deeply we crave mystery, even when that mystery smells of plaster and sulfuric acid. You know, the Cardiff giant still rests in a museum. He remains just as calm and majestic, and looking at him, one understands a simple truth. Sometimes, we do not need the truth, we need a sense of awe. But while in New York, people sought gods in the ground, on the opposite side of the world, in the silence of the ocean depths, one man discovered something that no scientist could explain. This is a tale of how a small mistake turned a routine voyage into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Story number 5. Breakfast for Ghosts in the Midst of the Atlantic. Listen, the ocean is not merely a vast expanse of water. It is a gigantic black memory that occasionally offers us such mysteries that it would be better if they remained at the bottom. Surely you've heard of the Titanic, but the Titanic is a tragedy with a script. It's all clear: iceberg, panic, orchestra. Now imagine a story where there's no iceberg, no storm, no cries for help, nothing at all. Just an empty deck and the creaking of masts. December 5th, 1872. The Atlantic Ocean, about 400 miles from the Azores Islands. A British vessel, the Mary Celeste, is slowly on its course. Captain David Morehouse squints at the horizon and spots a sailing ship. It was the Mary Celeste. Strangely enough, Marceau was familiar with that vessel. It had set sail from New York a week before him. But the Mary Celeste was drifting erratically, zigzagging like someone intoxicated. Marceau ordered the lifeboat lowered. The sailors climbed aboard. An overwhelming silence hung in the air. You know that moment in a movie when you want to shout at the characters? "Get out of there!" But this wasn't a film. The sailors entered the saloon, and that's when chills ran down their spines. A breakfast was laid out on the table, with bowls of porridge and cups of half-finished tea. On one of the plates rested a sliced, peeled orange, next to a still warm, nearly used-up pipe of the captain. Everything was in its place. In the captain's wife's cabin, a sewing machine remained with an unfinished child's dress lying on it. Can you grasp that? People hadn't planned to leave. They had simply vanished. In an instant. There were no signs of struggle, no blood. Piracy wasn't an issue here. All cargo, 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, was accounted for. Gold and jewels in the cabins had not been disturbed. The lifeboat? Yes, the only lifeboat was missing. But why? The sea was calm. The ship was in perfect condition. There was only a small amount of water in the hold, a common occurrence for wooden vessels. Picture this: 10 individuals, Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and 7 seasoned sailors. They were not the type to panic over trifles, yet they abandoned everything. The captain left his sword on the wall, and the sailors left their pipes and spare clothing behind. Frankly, there were so many theories that it could drive one mad. An attack by a giant squid. Well, people believed in such things back then. Hallucinations from spoiled flour were also a possibility, but the most logical and chilling theory emerged later. Alcohol. One of the barrels might have leaked. Alcohol vapors in a sealed hold create a small bomb. Perhaps there was a puff. Not an explosion, but rather a sudden release of gas. The captain, fearing the ship would blow up in seconds, ordered everyone to jump into the lifeboat without even grabbing their coats. They drifted away from the ship on a line, waiting, and apparently the line broke, or a sudden wind picked up. Imagine their faces. The lifeboat, overloaded with people, rocked on the waves, while their warm, reliable home, the Mary Celeste, majestically disappeared over the horizon under full sails, alone with the abyss, without a chance. They were never found, not a single piece of wreckage, not a single body, nothing. Just that half-eaten orange on the table, which became a symbol of the most mysterious disappearance in maritime history. By the way, when reinforcements brought the ship to Gibraltar, they almost faced accusations of murder for insurance fraud, but there was no evidence. The ghost ship simply delivered its passengers back to the ocean and fell silent forever. But if you think that disappearing is only possible on the open sea, you are mistaken. In the next chapter, we will transport ourselves to the very heart of civilized Europe, where, right in the midst of a bustling city, an entire people vanished. And no, this isn't a metaphor. This is the tale of how one ridiculous mistake turned a triumph of science into a grand scandal. Story number 6. The Last Gods of the Lost City in the Heart of London. Have you ever pondered how simple it is to deceive someone who considers themselves highly intelligent? You know, like that professor wearing glasses, certain that they know everything about the world. Frankly, the Victorian era was a golden age for such deceptions. People were so eager to uncover something lost and exotic that common sense simply flew out the window. Picture London in the year 1853. The city is engulfed in a yellow fog and the stench of coal. Suddenly, a sensational news story spreads across the newspapers. They have arrived in the city, the last representatives of the sacred caste of the Styx, straight from the mythical lost city of Ishimaya in the jungles of Central America. Their names were Maxime and Bartola. Imagine two tiny figures. They were so small that they were referred to as the children of the Styx, despite being fully grown. They possessed strange, unfamiliar facial features and had thick black hair. But most importantly, they spoke no known language. They emitted odd sounds resembling bird chirps and were constantly smiling. London went mad. Listen, this was not just a circus act. No. It was far more serious than that. They were received at Buckingham Palace. Queen Victoria herself had tea with them. Scholars from the Ethnological Society convened for emergency meetings. They measured their skulls, noted their sacred gestures, and seriously debated whether these two were a separate branch of humanity, a new species. Do you grasp the level of grandeur? The anthropologist Richard Owen, the very man who coined the term dinosaur, studied them and formulated theories about an ancient, degenerated race of priests. The public paid exorbitant amounts just to stand close by. It was believed that touching these gods would bring good fortune. This was a scientific triumph. It felt as though the history of the ancient world had come to life right in the heart of London's streets. But, how should I put it? Everything was far too perfect. Do you think this was the end of their fame? Hold on. The truth didn't surface immediately. It turned out that behind all this was an enterprising businessman named Roman Selva. He found these children in a remote village in El Salvador. They were a brother and sister afflicted with a rare genetic condition called microcephaly. Their poor mother simply couldn't feed them and gave them to Ramon for a few promises and seemingly a very small amount of money. Ramon wasn't a scholar, he was a brilliant storyteller. He invented the lost city. He ordered ancient costumes and taught the children to act peculiarly. And the scholars? Oh, the scholars just saw what they so desperately wanted to see. Their own biases played a cruel trick on them. The grand scientific triumph quickly transformed into a scandalous embarrassment that they tried to cover up for decades. Do you know what the saddest part is? Maxime and Bartola were never returned home. They continued to be exhibited as curiosities for many more years. They even got married, well, rather, they were forced to do so for the show, and lived a long life under the glare of stage lights, remaining the last of the sticks for those who still wanted to believe in a fairy tale. This is a tale of how effortlessly an ordinary person can become a prominent figure if they possess the right attire and a dash of audacity. By the way, if you believe that deception in Europe was limited to scholars, brace yourself. In the upcoming story, we will venture to a location where an entire nation decided to simply cease to exist on paper for one very peculiar reason. Story number 7. The state that was forgotten to be drawn. Listen, borders are a serious matter. They involve barbed wire, stern individuals in uniforms, and folders filled with seals. Typically, rivers of blood are shed for every inch of land. But imagine a scenario where two powerful neighbors, Prussia and the Netherlands, are staring blankly at a map of Europe after Napoleon's downfall for an entire year. Diplomats are divvying up the legacy of a grand empire. They sketch lines, argue about forests and rivers. And suddenly, a hiccup arises. A tiny patch of land, merely 3.5 kilometers, that's about the size of a couple of large parks. This small piece contains a zinc mine. Prussia claims, mine. The Netherlands retorts, dream on. And do you know what they decided? They chose not to engage in warfare. Instead, they concluded that this minuscule triangle of land would not belong to anyone at all. They established a neutral Modoset, a ghost state, an oversight in the system that lasted for over 100 years. Imagine life there. It was like a wild, illegal El Dorado right in the heart of orderly Europe. There were no taxes at all, no military. The police was comprised of one individual who, to be honest, spent most of his time dozing in the sun. People from all over Europe flocked there to open inexpensive taverns or to avoid military service. By the end of the 19th century, approximately 3,000 individuals resided there, officially not citizens of any country in the world. They had no flags, no anthem, just the mine, and total freedom. But the strangest event transpired later, in 1908. A doctor named Wilhelm Molly came alive in Modoset. He was, let's say, an enthusiast. He envisioned Modoset as the ideal place to establish the world's first state where everyone would speak the artificial language of Esperanto. Can you imagine? He wanted to rename the country to Amikeia, a place of friendship. They even began to print their own stamps and composed an anthem in Esperanto. To be honest, it was a chance for the kindest and oddest utopia in history. But reality always knocks at the door at the most inconvenient times, and usually it comes stomping in. When the First World War erupted, the Germans simply marched through that triangle and overlooked it. In 1915, they officially annexed it. After the war, the territory was handed over to Belgium, and that was it. No more utopia, no songs of friendship, only old border markers that still stand in the woods, a reminder of a time when 3 kilometers of land could be free from the entire world at once. By the way, if you think that creating an entire state due to an error is the pinnacle of human absurdity, prepare yourself. In the next story, we'll discuss sports, but not football or racing. We will delve into a time when thousands of people gathered in stadiums to witness others simply walk for days, weeks, until they nearly lost all semblance of humanity. Story number 8. 6 days of madness on your own 2 feet. Listen, have you ever tried simply walking? No, not to the nearest store for bread or through the park on a Sunday, but to walk for 6 consecutive days without stopping, nearly without sleep. Think it's torture? Honestly, in the latter half of the 19th century, thousands of people paid large sums just to witness it. Picture New York City. The year is 1879. Madison Square Garden. Inside, a thick haze of cheap cigars and the scent of sweat envelops the space. The massive arena is covered in sawdust, and people walk endlessly, like clockwork dolls, around the track. This was known as pedestrianism, and believe me, It was the most popular sport in America and England before baseball or soccer achieved significance. It was a spectacle on the edge of human endurance. The rules were simple, yet sadistic. You had to cover as many miles as possible in 6 days. 6 days, because Sunday was reserved for rest. Religion dictated that. But from Monday to Saturday, it was hell. The leader of this madness was a man named Edward Payson Weston. Wait, no, he wasn't just a leader, he was a rock star in this bizarre world. Imagine him, narrow pants, gaiters, an elegant walking stick in hand, and a maniacal gleam in his eyes. He walked and walked, day after day. Do you know how they rested? They didn't. They ate on the move. Runners or coaches sprinted alongside, handing them pieces of roasted meat or cups of broth. They napped for 15 to 20 minutes right on the track in tiny tents, and then the sound of a gong would signal it was time to rise again on their swollen, bloodied feet. Their knees wouldn't straighten, and their muscles felt as if filled with shattered glass, yet they marched on. By the 4th day, the real circus began. Due to sleep deprivation, the athletes started hallucinating. One champion, Daniel O'Leary, earnestly tried to step over imaginary walls that appeared before him on the track. Others began to argue with shadows. The audience was enthralled. They placed bets, they shouted, watching as people became mere shadows of themselves for the sake of a few $1,000s and a silver belt. But why? What was the point? Perhaps it was some primal honesty. People wanted to witness the limits, the moment when the body simply says, enough. But the spirit compelled them to take another step. 500 miles, 600 miles, in just 1 week, all on foot. And you know what is the strangest part? This sport vanished as suddenly as it appeared. Bicycles came along, then automobiles. Speed became more important than endurance. People stopped appreciating the art of slow self-destruction to the music of an orchestra. We simply forgot that our legs were once capable of such feats. Weston, by the way, lived to a ripe old age and continued to walk even when his peers could no longer rise from their chairs. It was as if he knew some secret of an eternal engine within us. But while in New York, people exhausted themselves out of their own will. The next story will take us to a place where the very earth decided to conduct an experiment on humanity. An experiment that spanned centuries and turned ordinary life into an endless carnival where no one wished to participate. Story number 9. A witness returned from silence. Listen, have you ever pondered how solid the boundary is between the realm of the living and what lies beyond it? We tend to believe that the courtroom is a place of logic, cold facts, and tangible evidence. But imagine a scenario where the sole witness in a murder case is the victim herself. And no, this isn't the plot of a low-budget horror film. It is a true story that made the American justice system of the late 19th century tremble with horror and confusion. January 1897, Greenbrier County, West Virginia. A remote area, snow-covered hills, where news travels slower than the mail coaches. Inside a small house, the body of a young woman, Elva Hister, is discovered. A neighborhood boy found her. She was lying motionless at the bottom of the stairs, quiet and cold. A doctor arrived only 3 hours later. And this is where things take a strange turn. Elva's husband, the local blacksmith Erasmus Shue, behaved, well, let's say unusual. He would not leave the body for a moment. He washed her himself, dressed her in a high stiff-collared gown, and tied a large scarf around her neck. When the doctor attempted to examine the girl's neck and head, Erasmus flew into a rage. He cried, shouted, and prevented anyone from touching his wife. To be honest, the doctor felt pity for the grieving husband and recorded the cause of death as a faint. The funeral was conducted swiftly. Elva was buried in cold earth, and everything seemed to be over. However, a mother's heart cannot be deceived by a collar or a scarf. Mary Jane Hister, Elva's mother, did not believe in that fainting spell. She sensed that a dark secret lay hidden in her daughter's grave. Every night, for 4 consecutive nights, she prayed. And listen, what happened next continues to baffle historians. Mary Jane claimed that Elva visited her directly in her room. The spirit of her daughter emerged from a cold glow. She was wearing that very gown. She told her mother that her husband, the kind blacksmith, had broken her neck in a fit of rage. To prove this, the ghost turned her head a full 360 degrees. Just picture this scene: silence in the room, the scent of candle wax, and a dead daughter twisting her head like a broken doll. Mary Jane approached the prosecutor. Do you think they laughed at her? Not at all. She was so persuasive, detailing specifics that only someone present could know, that the prosecutor dared to undertake the impossible. Exhumation. The body was retrieved from the ground a month later. When the doctors unwrapped the scarf, a dead silence enveloped the room. Elva's neck was broken. The vertebrae was shattered precisely as her mother described. This was shocking, a genuine legal deadlock. The trial commenced in the summer of that year. It was the only case in U.S. history where the testimony of a ghost became pivotal for the prosecution. Erasmus's attorney tried to depict Mary Jane as insane. He mockingly asked, "Well, what else did your daughter whisper to you?" But Mary stood resolute as a rock. She replied calmly, clearly, without a hint of doubt. And the jury? They believed her. Esma Shu received a life sentence. He passed away in prison a few years later. Meanwhile, Elvazona Hister has gone down in history as the Grinbrier Ghost. This is the only instance where a voice from beyond the grave silenced lawyers and judges alike. Do you know what's truly amusing? Even the most skeptical researchers cannot explain how Mary Jane discovered the secret about the neck injury, especially since her body had been so meticulously concealed by her husband. Perhaps a mother's love is the bridge that no laws of physics can ever destroy. But if justice in this story emerged from another realm, then in the next chapter we will discuss how an ordinary person can distort reality into a colossal falsehood, a lie that cost lives, even as those affected did not realize that their adversary was merely a fantasy crafted by a bored aristocrat. Story number 10. The War Over an Old Bucket. Listen, we tend to think that wars arise from grand ideas, be it religion, freedom, territory, or gold. At the very least, for the sake of a beautiful woman, as the ancient Greeks would have it. But imagine a scenario where thousands of armored men march into an open field to kill one another over an ordinary wooden bucket, a simple oak one used for watering horses. Honestly, this may sound like a script for an absurdist comedy, but in the 10th century, people in Italy took such matters extremely seriously. Picture Italy in the year 1325. This isn't the cozy country of pizza and tourists that we know today. It was a patchwork of city-states that despised each other so intensely that sparks flew. The principal foes? Bologna and Modena. They argued about everything, from politics to which pope was more legitimate. Now imagine a deafening night when a few audacious fellows from Modena stealthily ventured into the heart of Bologna. It was quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of torches. They weren't there to rob a bank or kidnap the governor. No, they approached the town well, untied an old, weather-worn oak bucket, and simply carried it off. Why? Well, hold on. This was a trophy, the utmost form of mockery. It's like if someone today snuck into your backyard and stole your favorite garden hose, then hung it in the town square for everyone to laugh at you. Bologna, of course, was furious. They demanded the bucket be returned. Modena replied in a spirit of defiance, "Come and take it." And Bologna did come. Listen, this was not a minor skirmish. Bologna assembled an army of 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, a massive force for that era. Against them stood Modena, with only 7,000 men. Imagine that battlefield near the locality of Zappalina. November 1325. The cold wind flutters the banners. And then something unbelievable happened. The smaller army of Modena, defending their right to the stolen bucket, utterly demolished the massive crowd of Bolognese. The battle lasted merely a couple of hours, yet during that time, roughly 2,000 lives were lost. 2,000 people perished for the sake of keeping a bucket in another city. The Modenese chased their enemies all the way to the gates of Bologna, and to ultimately humiliate the opponent? No, they did not conquer the city. They merely fetched yet another bucket from the well at the gates and returned home to celebrate. Do you think that's the end? Not at all. Modena preserved that very first bucket. They displayed it in the main tower of the city, Durlandine. It still hangs there today, do you understand? 700 years have passed. Those kings are long gone. Those popes have disappeared. The borders of Italy have shifted hundreds of times, yet the old, rotting wood remains. Sometimes I wonder, have we changed much? We are still just as ready to clash over trivial matters. It's just that our buckets look different now. But this oak artifact in Monet serves as a poignant reminder of how far human stubbornness can reach. By the way, if you think fighting over a bucket is the epitome of absurdity, just wait. In the next tale, we will travel to a place where people decided they could outsmart mathematics itself. And no, this isn't about the lottery. It's about a moment when a single letter in a document nearly erased an entire class from existence. Story number 11. Stone Letters from the Creator Himself. But, listen, we all enjoy feeling smarter than others, especially when we possess a diploma, a curly wig, and the title of Professor of Medicine. In the early 16th century, there lived in the German town of Würzburg such a man, Ogon Berenger. Frankly speaking, he was a walking encyclopedia of his time, yet he had one weakness, a passion. He was utterly obsessed with fossils. In those days, people did not yet understand what dinosaurs were. They believed the bones in the ground were either remnants of biblical giants or whims of nature, caprices of God, you see. As if the Creator sat on a cloud, bored, sculpting amusing oddities from stone to test our faith. Berenger believed this wholeheartedly. He searched for proof. He thirsted for a miracle. And so, the year was 1725, in May. 3 young students brought stones from Mount Eivelstadt to the professor. Berenger took them in hand, and he was left breathless. These were not merely resembling fish or leaves. No, the flat stones bore intricate carvings of perfect lizards, spiders on webs, birds, and even swooping comets. The sun with a face, the moon. Just picture his excitement. But wait, things became even more extraordinary. A week later, the students returned with further discoveries. The stones were inscribed with Hebrew and Latin, the name of God Himself. Berenger was in ecstasy. He concluded he had found direct correspondence from the heavens, that Mount Eivelstadt was a sacred site where God practiced the art of sculpting. The professor's colleagues, named Ignat Roderick and Georg von Eckhart, shook their heads. They said, "Igant, come to your senses. This is a forgery. Someone merely carved this with a knife." But Berenger? Oh, he was above that. He accused them of envy. He shouted that they were trying to tarnish his greatest discovery. He spent all his money, all his energy. He hired artists to illustrate each of the 2,000 stones. The year 1726 saw the release of his lavish book, Würzburg Lithography, the scientific work of his life. In it, he explained why these stones could not possibly be the work of man. Too perfect, he wrote, too divine. Now, brace yourselves. This will hurt. Just a short while after the book's release, Berenger returns to the mountain. He discovers the last stone, the one the students overlooked. He cleans it from dirt and freezes in place. Etched on the stone in the same divine script is his own name, Ogon Bartholomew Berenger. The world crumbles. Silence. Only the wind whistles in his ears. This was a prank, a grand, cruel joke. Roderick and von Eckhart, those envious colleagues, had simply hired some individuals to carve figures from soft limestone, fire them, and bury them along the professor's path. They wanted to teach him a lesson, to demonstrate that his fanaticism had blinded his reason, but they never anticipated that he would go so far as to publish a book. Berenger was driven mad with shame. He attempted to buy up the entire print run of his book. He spent his last pennies to obliterate the evidence of his folly. But books, as we know, do not burn, especially when they are already purchased by those who enjoy a good laugh. He died in poverty and disgrace. Although, there is a certain irony in it. Today, those very deceitful stones of Berenger are housed in the largest museums around the world. They are worth more than the true fossils of that time. People cross oceans to see a monument to humanity's desire to be deceived. By the way, if you think that fanaticism and a belief in miracles can blind only one professor, you are mistaken. In our next story, we will witness how an entire army, armed to the teeth, found themselves powerless in the face of silence and before a man who decided he could steal from the enemy not just victory, but the very essence of existence. Story number 12. The Ear That Declared War. Have you ever wondered how much your ear is worth? I mean, literally. You probably don't consider it anything that could change the course of world history. For us, it's just cartilage and skin. But imagine a time when one small piece of flesh, severed in a fit of rage, led to thousands of people plunging to the ocean floor, and mighty world powers began to crush each other to dust. Picture London, 1738, the Parliament Building. Inside, it's stuffy, with the scent of old wood and expensive wigs. The atmosphere is taut. Britain and Spain have been at odds for decades over the right to trade in the Caribbean. It was an era of greed, a grand chess game where the pieces were islands and the squares were nautical miles. And there, among the esteemed lords, stands a man. His name is Robert Jenkins, a simple sailor and captain of a trading vessel. He steps into the middle of the hall. Silence. Hundreds of eyes are on him. Jenkins does not speak of lofty matters. He doesn't discuss taxes. He simply pulls out a small glass bottle from his pocket. Inside, in murky, salty water, floats something gray and shriveled, his own left ear. Frankly, at this moment, one could hear a pin drop in the Parliament. Jenkins begins to recount. Listen, this happened 7 years before that day. Imagine, 1731. His ship, the Rebecca, is sailing in the Caribbean Sea. He is halted by a Spanish patrol boat. The Spaniards are passionate people. They accuse the skipper of smuggling. The captain of the patrol, one Julio Fandino, bursts into a rage. He draws his saber and instantly slices off Jenkins' ear. But do you know what is the wildest part? Legend has it that Fandino hurled this ear at the skipper's face and shouted, "Deliver this to your king, and tell him that he will meet the same fate if he crosses my path." Jenkins, he didn't discard it, nor did he bury it. For 7 years, 7 long years, he kept his severed ear in a jar of rum or brine. He carried it like a gruesome souvenir. And when politicians needed a reason to go to war, that reason naturally came to them, or rather, it sailed into their hands in a jar. The lords cried out, "An affront to our honor! An outrage against a British subject! How dare they touch our sailor's ear?" This was the perfect spark for a conflict. In the year 1739, Great Britain officially declared war on Spain. In the history books, it became known by the utterly absurd title, War of Jenkins' Ear. Do you think it was a minor skirmish? Not at all. The war dragged on for 9 years. 9 years. Over 20,000 lives were lost. Dozens of cities were burned, and hundreds of ships were sunk. Massive expeditions crossed the Atlantic to exact revenge for one severed cartilage. It was chaos that spread across half the world, from Florida to the Pacific shores. The most ironic part of this whole tale is that the ear itself and Jenkins were forgotten within a month after the fighting began. The skipper had his 15 minutes of fame and faded into the shadows of history. And the war? The war continued on its own path, consuming resources and lives until everyone was utterly exhausted. When viewed from our time, one strange truth becomes evident. People don't always need a complex reason to start destroying each other. Sometimes, all it takes is to show them a jar filled with something grotesque and shout louder about honor. By the way, if you think it's strange to go to war over an ear, just wait. In the next story, we will travel to a place where people believe they could build an entire world without using words at all, only to realize that silence can be far more dangerous than any shout. This is a tale of how one scientific experiment turned into a trap with no way out. Story number 13. The man who bore the sky on his shoulders in total darkness. You know, we often marvel at great buildings, pyramids, castles, enormous cathedrals. We look up at them and think of the grandeur of their architects. But honestly, behind each stone giant often stands a single individual, someone whose feet is buried so deeply that it cannot even be seen under the most powerful microscope of history. Imagine England, 1905, Winchester Cathedral. This is not just a church, it is the ancient heart of the country where kings were crowned, a massive, heavy structure that has stood for nearly 1,000 years. And then the priests and parishioners began to notice something amiss. First, thin cracks appeared in the walls, followed by the sound of falling stones. One could not merely fit a finger into the cathedral walls, but an entire head. The colossal structure began to tilt, slowly and inexorably to one side. It sank. It turned out that the ancient builders made a fatal mistake. They erected the cathedral on marshland, on a layer of peat and sand that had turned into a liquid mush over the centuries. The engineers were horrified. If they began to dig beneath the foundation to reinforce it, water would simply surge in, and the cathedral would collapse like a house of cards right onto the heads of the workers. A dead end, a death sentence for history. And at this moment, William Walker steps onto the scene. A regular, quiet man with a bushy mustache. He was not an architect, nor was he an engineer. He was a deep-sea diver. Imagine his workday. 6 hours a day for 6 years straight. William donned a heavy copper helmet that weighed over 20 kilograms. He wore lead boots and had huge weights secured to his chest. The total weight of his gear was nearly 90 kilograms. In this suit, he descended beneath the cathedral. Listen, this wasn't a beautiful dive into clear waters. No, it was black, icy sludge, mud, and silt. He worked in complete, utter darkness. Raising a lantern would have been futile. The light simply languished in the murky slime. William relied solely on touch. Thousands of tons of ancient stone hung just above him, ready to crush him at any moment. One misstep, one mistake, and he would become part of the foundation forever. He worked methodically, step by step. He scooped out the silt from under the foundation with his hands and replaced it with bags of concrete. Picture this scale. Over 6 years, he alone laid 25,000 bags of cement, 115,000 concrete blocks, and 300,000 bricks. One man in the darkness beneath the water, while above, people prayed and sang psalms, unknowingly relying on the fingertips of one diver for their lives and their cathedral. You know, when he finished, the cathedral stopped sinking, it stabilized, and the cracks were sealed. William Walker simply removed his helmet, wiped his face, and went home. He was not called a knight, nor was he awarded golden crowns. He just did his job. He saved the sky of England from falling into the mire, remaining in the shadow of the foundation. By the way, he died a few years later from the Spanish flu. Sad, isn't it? But every time you see photographs of Winchester Cathedral, remember, these stones are not resting on the ground. They are supported by the shoulders of a man who dared to face the darkness. However, while William Walker battled icy water and mud to save a sanctuary, the hero of our next story encountered something much stranger, a place where even the logic of space itself cracked. This is the tale of a man who sought to outsmart not nature, but death itself, by creating a house where finding an exit was impossible. Story number 14. The Cathedral of Trash and a Promise Made to the Heavens. Do you believe in deals? Not the kind signed in air-conditioned office suites, but those made in delirium when lungs are burning from tuberculosis and the footsteps of the Grim Reaper are already heard outside. To be honest, most of us would promise anything in those moments. But how many people, getting out of bed, would choose to spend the next 60 years of their lives fulfilling that promise? Imagine Spain, 1961, the small town of Majada del Campo. It's quite close to Madrid, yet it feels like the edge of the world. A young novice, Justa Gallega Martinez, lies in his cell. He is dying. Expelled from the monastery out of fear of contagion, he is alone and weak. In this ringing silence, he whispers, "If I survive, I will build the cathedral in your honor." And he did survive. He simply got better. The doctors were baffled, while Justa just picked up a shovel. Listen, he had absolutely nothing. No architectural education, no plans, not a single peseta in his pocket, and no building permit. What he had was a piece of land left by his parents, and a faith bordering on madness. Neighbors shook their heads, calling him crazy justa, yet he began to dig the foundation. Imagine this process, day in and day out, for 6 long decades. Justa woke at 4 in the morning and headed to his construction site. What materials did he use? That's where it gets truly astonishing. This was a cathedral made from waste. He collected defective bricks, old tires, paint cans, and scraps of rebar from nearby dumps. He poured the columns into old gasoline cans. The dome? Oh, he crafted the dome using pieces of plastic and wire. This was no small chapel. It was a colossal structure, rising to 40 meters, featuring a huge central dome, colonnades, and an inner courtyard. When you look at it, it appears to be the work of a mad genius, or a dream crystallized in concrete. There isn't a single straight line, nor a boring corner. It's a labyrinth, a true forest of brick and debris, where one could wander for hours and still not find an exit. Do you understand? A man who knew nothing of mathematics built a structure that has stood for decades without collapsing. Do you know what's most remarkable? Justa lived to 96 years old. He constructed his cathedral almost until his last breath. He never asked for money, nor did he hire workers. Occasionally his nephews lent a hand, but mostly it was the labor of his own hands and one will. When asked why he did it, he simply shrugged and stated it was his duty. A deal is a deal. However, hold on. Officially, this cathedral was never recognized as a temple. To the authorities, it was an illegal structure, and to architects it posed a hazardous risk. Yet for millions worldwide, it stands as a monument to what one person can achieve when they decide that death is merely an opportunity to begin something great. Justa passed away in 2021, leaving a mountain of bricks that reached the sky. By the way, if you think building a cathedral alone is the peak of human obsession, just wait. In the next chapter, we'll travel to a place where people attempted not to erect something eternal, but rather to erase all memory of their existence. This is the story of a people who decided to deceive time, hiding where no one was ever meant to find them. Story number 15, The Twilight People from a Forgotten Hollow. So, have you ever pondered how profound isolation can alter human nature itself? We are accustomed to thinking of the world as an immense melting pot where everything is mixed together. However, imagine a place where time has stood still and the mountains have risen into such towering walls that not even the winds of change can pass through them. Picture the year 1820 in eastern Kentucky, in a little spot known as Troublesome Creek. The name speaks for itself, a stream of troubles. This was a remote area, a true impenetrable thicket, where it would take a full day to reach the nearest neighbor along animal trails. Into this very place arrived a young man named Martin Fugate, an orphan from France. He sought merely peace and a bit of land. He married a local girl, Elizabeth Smith, an ordinary, pale, red-haired American. They began to have children, and soon whispers started circulating in the area. Frankly, people were quite superstitious back then, but what they witnessed at the Fugate household was beyond comprehension. 7 children, 4 of whom were blue. No, wait, I don't mean sad or cold. Their skin was the color of indigo, like a stormy sky or a ripe plum. Imagine children running about the verdant hills of Kentucky, their faces and hands glowing with an unnatural, otherworldly blue light. What would you do? Perhaps you would rush to a doctor, but the Fugates did not run anywhere. They simply withdrew deeper into the woods. The mountains are good at keeping secrets. The family grew, but due to their isolation, they were compelled to marry, let's say, very close relatives. Cousins were marrying cousins. The blue gene, which would normally fade away in an average world after a few generations, became a law of life here in the shadow of the mountains. A whole century passed. Imagine, for 100 years in the forests of Kentucky, an entire dynasty of blue people lived on. They were not sick. They were robust, working at sawmills and hunting. Yet, They were outcasts. Only the locals, accustomed to them, referred to them as the blue fugates. Children in schools, when they managed to attend, would tease them, and adults avoided their homes, crossing themselves. The truth only surfaced in the early 60s of the 20th century. In 1960, a young hematologist named Madison Cawein heard the legend of the Blue People and thought it was just a tale. But he ventured into the mountains, and he found them. Listen, he described his first encounter like this. They simply emerged from the woods. Patrick and Rachel. They were blue down to their fingertips, yet when they smiled, their teeth were dazzlingly white against that twilight hue. This was a shock to science. It turned out to be a rare genetic disorder called methemoglobinemia. In their blood, there was a deficiency of a particular enzyme, so their blood wasn't red but a chocolate brown color. Through their thin skin, it shone blue. No magic at all, just a glitch in the code of life. Cawein found a cure. And do you know what was the most ironic twist? To normalize their skin, he had them drink methylene blue dye. Within minutes after consuming this blue concoction, the blueness began to fade from their faces. They transformed right before his eyes. For the first time in a century and a half, the fugates looked in the mirror and saw people who blended into the crowd. Today, there are no more blue fugates. The gene dissolved when roads were made through the mountains, and people began leaving their hollows. Only faded old photographs and legends remain about how long a secret can last if it is hidden behind tall trees and human fear of the unfamiliar. But while in this story, people attempted to conceal their essence within the forests, in the next chapter, we will discuss a man who chose to hide the very history itself. This tale is about a grand discovery made in complete darkness behind a stone wall, which waited for its moment for almost 1,000 years, until one monk decided to create an extra hole in the wall. This is story number 16, A Prison for Memory in the Heart of the Desert. Now, have you ever pondered what lies right behind you while you are engaged in the most mundane household tasks? For instance, when you are simply sweeping the floor or dusting a shelf? Honestly, we tend to believe that the world has been thoroughly explored, that all great treasures have been found, and all mysteries unraveled. But imagine a person who merely wanted to tidy up an old, abandoned place and accidentally discovered a door that had been locked for nearly 1,000 years. Picture the edge of the world, China, bordering the Gobi Desert in 1900. A location named Dunhuang, which was once a significant crossroads of the Silk Road. However, by the 20th century, it had become a forgotten hole, buried in sand. Amid the cliffs lay the Mogao Caves, hundreds of ancient temples carved directly into the rock. And in these caves lived a man named Wang Yuanlu. He was not a renowned scholar, but rather a simple Taoist monk who, to be honest, took on the monumental task of restoring these temples. He lived in poverty, collecting pennies for paint and perpetually cleaning something. On June 25, 1900, Wang decided to clear one of the caves of sand blown in by the wind. He worked alone. The silence was so profound that one could hear the rustle of sand beneath the broom. Suddenly, his hand froze. He noticed a strange crack in the wall adorned with ancient paintings. You know how it feels. You just sense that there is emptiness behind the wall. He knocked. The sound was dull. Wang took a knife and began to scrape the plaster. And behind this wall was a door. A small, unremarkable stone door. Imagine his feelings. Darkness, the scent. Oh, that scent you will never forget if you ever catch a whiff of it. It's the smell of millennia-old dust, dry paper, and frozen time. Wang entered with a small candle, and its light flickered against the dark mountain. No, it was not gold. It was a mountain of scrolls. They lay there, packed tightly from floor to ceiling. 10 centuries, imagine that, about 50,000 manuscripts. They were hidden there in the early 10th century when invaders approached the city. The monks simply sealed the entrance to the library. They plastered it over with paintings and died, taking the secret with them. The world forgot about them. Dynasties replaced each other, empires were born and perished, while behind that thin wall lay the entire wisdom of the ancient East, resting in silence. There were texts in languages that no one remembered anymore. There existed the oldest printed book in the world, the Diamond Sutra, produced centuries before Gutenberg. There were maps of the night sky that were more precise than anything Europe had been aware of at that time. It was a time capsule that Wang concealed with his broom. But do you know what is the saddest part? Wang was an honest man. He did not wish to steal. He approached the local officials. He presented them with invaluable scrolls, and they looked at him like he was insane. "We do not have money to store this," they said. "Just bury it again." Can you imagine the level of indifference? Then came the foreigners, the antiquities hunters. First, there was the British Aurel Stein, followed by the Frenchman Paul Pelliot. They grasped everything in an instant. They offered Wang meager coins to repair his temples in exchange for cartloads filled with priceless manuscripts. Even now, it is viewed as the greatest national tragedy in China. The library was scattered across the globe, from London to Paris. However, wait a moment. If Wang had not opened that door, perhaps the sands of the Gobi would have buried those caves forever, and we would never have known how people thought and what they believed 1,000 years ago. Sometimes, a great discovery is merely a matter of spotting a timely crack in the wall. By the way, if you think that discovering a forgotten library is the peak of fortune, hold on. In the next chapter, we will talk about a man who found something far more tangible, although he was not an archaeologist. He was an ordinary worker who stumbled upon a mechanism that should not have existed. Story number 17, The Mechanical Prayer from the Iron Womb. Have you ever wondered when the era of robots truly began? We tend to believe that it all originated in the 20th century, with Silicon Valley, wires, and microchips. But imagine a world 400 years before the first computer. A world where electricity was considered magic, and the most complex item in the household was the fireplace tongs. Picture Spain, 1562. The royal palace of Madrid is enveloped in eerie silence. King Philip II, the most powerful man on the planet, sits by the bedside of his son, Prince Don Carlos. The boy is dying. He fell down the stairs, and the doctors, honestly, only made it worse. They drilled his skull, bled him, and applied raw meat to him. Nothing helped. The king, driven mad by grief, did what any person of his time would do. He turned to God, hosting a solemn feast. If his son survives, Philip would perform a miracle in return. And then, listen, remarkably, the boy recovers, completely inexplicably. And here's where it gets strange. Philip does not simply build a temple. He summons a man named Juan de la Turiano. He was an engineer, a clockmaker, the Leonardo da Vinci of his time. The king orders him to create a monument of gratitude, but not from stone, rather from iron, wood, and fear. Juanel crafted a mechanical monk. Imagine a figure about 40 centimeters tall. It is clad in the genuine robe of the Franciscan order, but beneath the fabric lies a true nightmare for a person of that era. A complex assembly of iron gears, levers, and springs. 1,600 years ago, a man created a programmable being. Listen, this was not merely a wind-up doll. When it was wound up, the monk began to walk on his own. He moved his legs, hidden beneath his robe. He turned his head and gazed at the audience with his glassy eyes. His lips moved, mimicking the words of a prayer. With one hand, he brought the crucifix to his lips, while with the other, methodically, in a chilling rhythm, he beat his chest. Tap, pause, tap. It was so realistic that people fell to their knees. They thought a spirit had possessed the wooden figure. The monk walked in circles, nodded his head, and continued his timeless, silent, penitent prayer. A robot eternally asking for forgiveness for the sins of its creator. But do you know what is the most astonishing thing about this story? Wait a moment, does this truly blow your mind? 450 years have passed. 450, and this mechanism is still operational. In the 1970s, it was discovered in the storage of the Smithsonian Institution. They wound it up, and it walked. It began to nod its head and beat its iron chest, just as it did in the palace of Philip II. The gears, handcrafted in the 15th century, proved more reliable than all our smartphones and servers. Watching this little being move across the table is unsettling. It possesses some ancient cold energy. It stands as a monument to a time when the line between faith and mechanics was as thin as a human hair. By the way, if you think creating the Iron Man in the 15th century was the pinnacle of engineering, you are mistaken. In the next chapter, we will venture to a place where people decided to challenge not God, but gravity itself. A story about a man who believed he could fly, relying only on his audacity and an old blanket. Story number 18. Icarus, out of hubris and wings made of oiled fabric. Listen, have you ever felt that strange, tingling urge to simply take a step off a cliff? Not to fall, but because of that insane, nearly impossible chance that you will not plummet down, but rather catch the air? To be honest, most of us just recoil from the edge and go grab a coffee. But in the mid-19th century, in a tiny Polish village, there lived a man who decided he was not a human, but a bird. Imagine the place called Authoritative in the year 1866, a remote province where the most intricate machine was a cart, and the greatest treasure was a cow. There lived Jan Vinek, an ordinary carpenter, illiterate and quiet, always covered in sawdust. He carved wooden saints for the local church. But you see, while his hands shaped the boards, his eyes were always on the sky. He spent years watching the birds. Listen, he didn't just observe, he dissected their flight with his mind. He studied the way wings curved, how feathers lay, and how currents of wind held weight. He was a genius of aerodynamics in a world that had not even invented the pedal-powered bicycle. And so, he decided to build wings. Picture this scene. A dark shed, the smell of ash, tar, and boiled oil. Jan was crafting a structure from lightweight ash and covering it with fine linen fabric. But to ensure the fabric didn't allow air to pass through, he soaked it in linseed oil. Do you know what progress smelled like in the mid-19th century? Rancid oil and the sweat of a madman. He named his invention the lots. These were enormous wings that were fastened to his back and legs with straps. And then the day arrived. The Pentecost of 1866. Thousands of people flocked to the village. It was indeed a celebration. Yet, all were waiting for Nemes. They awaited Jan. Jan climbed to the highest point in the vicinity, the church bell tower. Imagine that height, 45 meters. The wind whistled in his ears. Below, a sea of heads. Thousands of people held their breath in anticipation. Some crossed themselves, others laughed, and a few prepared a cart to take away a body. Jan ran. Wait, take a moment to visualize this. A second of silence, a heartbeat, and he leaped. But he didn't fall. Listen, he did not plummet like a stone. The enormous wings caught the rising airflow. Jan was airborne. He soared. He glided over fields and forests for more than 10 kilometers, steering his flight with movements of his legs. Imagine the faces of the peasants witnessing their neighbor, the carpenter Jan, flying above them like some ancient angel. It was a shock. It was a triumph. He continued such flights for several years. He became a local legend, but the sky has its own rules, and it doesn't appreciate being deceived for too long. During another festival that year, a strong side wind picked up. Jan jumped. The wing couldn't withstand the strain, and he fell in front of the crowd. Do you know what's the most astonishing part? He survived the fall, but lived for only 2 more months. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and his wings were simply burned, as the church deemed them a devilish contraption. Do you understand? A man outpaced the Wright brothers by 40 years using only ash and old oil. Yet the world chose to forget about it, because it resembled too much a miracle. Today, Jan is remembered only in his hometown of Nakia. But the next time you look out the airplane window, think of the carpenter from Otporisha, who proved that motors aren't needed for flight. Only a dream and some oiled linen. Yet if Jan Vinek sought freedom in the skies, the hero of our next story searched for it within his own mind. A tale about a man who believed he could talk to inanimate objects and how those objects began to respond to him. Story number 19. The Soldier Who Forgot How to Close His Eyes. You know, have you ever caught yourself realizing that time is our most despotic master? We all live by its decree. We eat when it commands, work, and, most importantly, we succumb to oblivion when it turns off the lights for us. Sleep. It is our obligatory tribute to nature. 1/3 of our lives is spent in this strange state reminiscent of a little death. Now, imagine a person who simply stopped paying this tax. Picture a world engulfed in flames. 1915, the First World War. Mud, barbed wire, and the endless roar of cannons. On the Eastern Front, among the ranks of the Austro-Hungarian army served an ordinary guy named Palern. He was not a hero out of novels. He was simply a cadet who wished to return home. However, fate, to be honest, had its own plans for him, quite literally. During one of the battles, a Russian bullet found its target. It struck him directly in the temple. Wait, just picture that moment. The impact. Darkness. The doctors at the field hospital could only shrug their shoulders. With such a wound, survival was thought impossible. This was a given. Yet, he opened his eyes. He survived. The bullet destroyed part of his frontal lobe, but left him able to breathe. However, when the bandages were removed, a troubling truth was revealed. Kern could no longer sleep at all. You see, this was not the usual insomnia where one tosses and turns counting sheep. No, his eyelids simply refused to close. His brain stopped signaling the need for rest. The doctors were in disbelief. They administered sedatives that could put an elephant to sleep. They poured liters of tranquilizers into him. They tried to hypnotize him. And you know what? Pal just sat on the bed and stared at them with his eternally open eyes. He was alert, fully conscious, and felt no weariness. Do you think he had lost his mind? Far from it. Pal Kern lived for another 40 years after that injury. 4 decades without a single second of sleep. Just imagine his life. While the sun set and the world sank into silence, nothing changed for Pal. He read books, he wrote letters, he strolled through the night streets of Budapest. His life became 3 times longer than any of ours. While we perished in our beds, he continued to exist. He referred to it as his eternal day. Of course, this was not a gift from fate. He began to suffer from terrible headaches. His eyes ached from the unrelenting light. To give them some respite, he donned dark glasses and simply sat in an armchair, staring into the void. But his mind never switched off. Imagine carrying that burden, a decade of an unending stream of thoughts. No dreams, no oblivion, only reality. Cold, infinite reality. Scientists from around the world came to study this phenomenon. They could not find an explanation, but Pal simply lived on. He worked in social welfare, attended theaters, socialized with friends. He passed away in 1955. And frankly, I believe that at that moment he finally felt what he had been longing for 40 years. Relief. This is a story about how a tiny lead bullet can shatter the greatest mechanism of nature. Pal Kern became a man who conquered biology, but lost peace. By the way, if you think losing the ability to sleep is the limit of the human mind's oddities, just wait. In the next chapter, we will discuss how a single artifact, unearthed from the dust of ages, made people believe that our ancestors knew far more about the cosmos than we dare to assume. This is the story of a letter that came from nowhere and changed everything. Story number 20. The Shadow of the Pilgrim in the Pink City. So, have you ever wondered how one could hide an entire city? Not just a house or a street, but a colossal metropolis with temples, palaces, and amphitheaters seating thousands. Moreover, he chose to hide it not in the dense jungles of the Amazon, but almost right under everyone's nose, in a desert that caravans had traversed for centuries. Imagine a place that was believed for 600 years to be nothing more than a fairy tale, a legend whispered among Bedouins by the campfire, one that no civilized individual ever truly believed in. To be honest, the world of the early 19th century was filled with such unknowns. In the year 1812, in Jordan, the heat was so intense that the stones felt like glowing coals. A man stumbled along a dusty road. His name was Ibrahim ibn Abdullah. He wore a worn-out robe and a turban. He sported a thick black beard. He spoke Arabic flawlessly, was well-versed in all the subtleties of the Quran, and conducted himself like a devout Muslim scholar. But hold on, things were not quite as they seemed. Beneath the guise of Ibrahim hid a Swiss national and adventurer named Ludwig Burckhardt. At 28 years old, he was a scholar, a risk-taker, and, to be frank, a man with nerves of steel. He had spent several years in Syria perfecting the language so that he wouldn't be recognized. Why was he in search of Petra, the fabled pink city that, according to legend, was carved directly into the rocks and had vanished from maps since the time of the Crusaders? Consider the level of risk involved. Had the Bedouins sensed that a European infidel was before them, seeking ancient treasures, he would have been swiftly dispatched without hesitation or words. But Johann was clever. He spread the rumor that he was hosting a ceremonial feast to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of the prophet Aaron. This tomb, according to tradition, was located right where the ruins were said to hide. Listen, this was a gamble at the brink of life and death. He hired a guide and they traversed narrow canyons where the walls pressed in so tightly that the sky transformed into a slender blue thread. Suddenly, the canyon opened up. A narrow fissure stretching over a kilometer. Silence. Only the sound of hoofbeats echoed. At the very end of this dark corridor, in a narrow gap, Johann beheld it. Al-Khazneh, the treasury. An enormous facade carved directly into the pink rock. Picture this spectacle. Sunlight poured onto the coral stone, making it glow as if from within. Columns, statues of gods, exquisite intricate carvings, and all of this in the midst of a dead desert. Johann nearly revealed himself. He gasped. His hand reached for his notebook to sketch, but the guide was watching him. Suspiciously, coldly. "You're looking for gold, not a grave," he grumbled. Johann quickly regained his composure. He didn't even stop. He simply walked past the greatest architectural wonder, glancing at it only momentarily. Can you imagine the willpower required not to scream in delight when a lost world opens up before you? He sacrificed his goat, offered a prayer, and left. He departed to return to Cairo and announce to the world, "Petra is not a myth. It exists. It is real." Do you know what's most ironic? Johann never saw Petra in all its glory. He died 5 years later from dysentery, without having published his detailed diaries. But he managed to ignite a spark. Ever since, the Pink City has been flooded with researchers, artists, and eventually millions of tourists. This is a tale about how the greatest secrets of the world are often hidden behind a thin veil of our distrust. Sometimes, it takes just one person willing to don someone else's attire and risk everything for that veil to tear apart. By the way, if you think locating a lost city in the mountains is a miracle, brace yourself. In the following chapter, we will discuss a place where people strived not to build a city, but rather a perfect society, one devoid of currency, private property, and most importantly, free from human frailty. This is the story of how the dream of paradise on earth turned into one of the strangest and most frightening experiments in American history. Story number 21, Paradise on Earth, Locked Behind a Fence. Listen, have you ever pondered how far a person might go in the quest for absolute happiness? Not the kind that we purchase on credit, but genuine bliss, right here on our sinful earth. To be frank, the mid-19th century in America was a time when people were going crazy over utopias. Everyone wanted to create their own little Eden. However, what transpired in New York State makes even the most liberal among us fidget nervously. Imagine the year 1848, a time of transformation. Carriages rolled down the roads while people debated about freedom and God. And then, there emerged a man named John Humphrey Noyes. He had an idea. Wait, it was not just an idea. It was an obsession. He believed that the Second Coming had occurred in the year 70, which meant that we all lived in a world where sin no longer existed. And if sin was absent, we no longer needed any rules. He founded a commune called Oneida. At first it resembled a fairy tale. 300 individuals, a vast and luxurious mansion they called the communal house. Silence, perfect order, a library, and musical evenings. They were not a disheveled group of fanatics. No, they were educated, affluent individuals who completely renounced private ownership. Everything was communal, from the pots in the kitchen to the clothing in the wardrobes. Strangely enough, they also rejected marriage. Noyes considered that exclusive love for one person was selfish. This flawed sentiment got in the way of loving everyone equally. Thus, he introduced a system of complex marriage. Imagine this. Every man in the commune was officially regarded as the husband of every woman. Conversely, anyone could enter anyone else's room, provided there was prior agreement through a mediator. It was a bizarre social mechanism. They lived this way for 30 years. 30 years devoid of jealousy and quarrels, under the strict control of Noyes himself. He termed it free love, but in reality, it was the tyranny of an ideal. Do you know what's the most outrageous part? They had a procedure called mutual criticism. Picture this. You sit in a chair in the center of the hall, while the remaining 300 individuals take turns telling you everything they think about you to your face. Every weakness you have, every unnecessary smile, every sign of selfishness. People would leave in tears, yet feeling cleansed. It was psychological lobotomy conducted with smiles. But then, Noyes decided to take it even further. He decided it was time to engineer the ideal people. Selection. They called it stirpiculture. Noyes himself determined who would bear children and with whom, aiming for perfect offspring. This marked the first recorded eugenics experiment on the scale of an entire community. Can you grasp that? They attempted to play gods in a specific region of New York State. And that's when everything began to fall apart. The youth, raised in this paradise, started asking questions. They glimpsed the world beyond. They yearned for ordinary, mundane love with a single partner, complete with a ring on their finger. The year was 1879. Internal conflicts, threats of arrest from authorities, and Noyes' own aging led to the disintegration of the community. Noyes fled to Canada while his wives and husbands were left behind, stranded. However, hold on, that's not the conclusion. The most ironic aspect of this tale is what remains of Oneida today. They were industrious folks. To survive, they began crafting spoons and forks from silver-plated metal. When the commune fell apart, they transformed into a standard corporation. Today, Oneida stands as one of the largest cutlery manufacturers in the world. You see, the empire of knives and forks emerged from the oddest sexual and genetic laboratory of the 19th century. Every time you grasp a spoon bearing this mark, remember that it not only carries the aroma of soup, but also the dream of a paradise that turned out to be too cramped for the human soul. And while in Oneida people tried to merge into one, the next chapter will introduce you to an individual who, conversely, found himself utterly alone in a world where no one literally understood him. This is the story of how a single sound can become a curse, and solitude the only means of preserving one's sanity. Story number 22. 6 years in the icy embrace of emptiness. Have you ever pondered what a person is willing to do simply to wake up tomorrow? Not for career or money, but for the very act of breathing? We are accustomed to comfort. Turn on the tap and water flows. Press a button and warmth surrounds you. But imagine a scenario where your entire world has shrunk to a rocky outcrop in the midst of an icy ocean, and your possessions consist of a rusty axe and a handful of flour. To be honest, this tale sounds like the harshest fantasy, yet it actually occurred. The year was 1743, the Arctic. A group of Russian Pomor fishermen on a small vessel set out to the shores of Spitzbergen, then known as Grumont. Their goal was to hunt walruses, but the north is a treacherous place. Their ship was trapped in the ice near the uninhabited Edge Island. 4 sailors, Alexei Inkov, his son Krisanov, Stepan Sharapov and Fyodor Varagin decided to take a risk. They brought a rifle, 12 bullets, an axe, a knife, a kettle, and 20 pounds of flour. They disembarked onto the ice and ventured toward the shore, hoping to find a hut they had heard of from the elders. They discovered an old, partially collapsed log cabin. They decided to spend the night there and return to the ship for the remaining supplies in the morning. But in the morning, imagine their faces. The ship was completely gone. A storm had risen overnight, the ice had cracked, and the vessel was either crushed or swept away into the open sea. Silence. Only the wind whistles among the stones. 4 men stand on the shore in whatever they were wearing. Without food, without warm clothes, with 12 bullets for the rest of their lives. What would you do? Perhaps you would simply sit on the rocks and wait for the end. But these men were made of a different substance. They began building their own civilization on this patch of permafrost. Once the 12 bullets ran out, they used them to hunt 12 caribou. And they had to become inventors. Listen, it's incredible. They discovered a washed-up fin on the shore, pieces of wood with rusty nails. With those nails, using stones in place of hammers, they forged tips for spears and arrows. They crafted bows from the tendons of slain animals and branches. They began hunting polar bears. Imagine the struggle between a human and a massive predator armed only with a homemade spear. Over time, they killed 10 polar bears. This was their means of survival, their meat, their fur, their very existence. They lived there for 6 years. 6 long years. Picture that rhythm of life. A winter that lasts forever. A polar night when the sun does not rise for months. They sat in their hut, burning fat in homemade lamps fashioned from clay and moss. They sewed clothing for themselves using animal hides and bone needles. The worst part was not the cold or the hunger. The most dreadful was scurvy. Fyodor Varagin, the largest and, as later noted, the laziest among them, refused to move, refused to drink the raw reindeer blood that sustained the others. He died in the 6th year. The remaining 3 buried him in the frozen ground, wondering who would be next. But fate is a capricious mistress. On August 15, 1749, a trading vessel inadvertently approached the island. The sailors spotted people on the shore, dressed in strange fur outfits, waving their arms and shouting. When they were lifted aboard, the crew couldn't believe that these savages were their countrymen, who had been presumed dead for over 6 years. Do you know what is most astonishing? When they returned to Arkhangelsk, Alexei Inkov went straight to church. He didn't run after money or fame. He simply wanted to thank the heavens for not forgetting them in that icy wasteland. This story is the finest testament to human tenacity. We can survive anywhere if we have even a drop of hope and an old rusty nail. By the way, if you think surviving 6 years on a deserted island in the Arctic is the limit of endurance, wait until next time. In the next chapter, we will talk about a man who also found himself in complete isolation, but not among the ice, rather in the very center of a vast city. A story about being able to see everyone, hear everyone, yet remain invisible to the entire world for decades. Story number 23. The architect of emptiness beneath the bustling pavement. Have you ever thought about what lies right beneath your feet? Well, you walk along the sidewalk, rushing to work, cursing the noise of traffic. You assume the ground beneath you is a monolith, a bastion? But imagine that in the very heart of a crowded London, beneath an ordinary brick house, one man spent decades gnawing at reality itself, quite literally. Frankly speaking, this tale offers a new perspective on quiet neighbors. The year was 1960 in the Hackney district, a place where everyone knows each other or pretends to. There lived William Little, an ordinary retired engineer and electrician, a modest and polite man with a slight receding hairline. Then one day, he decided to dig a wine cellar. But wait, things did not go as planned. William grabbed a shovel, then a pickaxe, followed by a homemade winch, and he simply could not stop. Picture the rhythm of his life. 40 years. 40 long years. Every morning he would descend into a hole in his kitchen floor to start excavating London clay. While prime ministers changed, kings were born and died, and cars began to populate the streets, which no one dreamed of in the 60s, William existed in his own era, an age of earth and stone. He unearthed a labyrinth. Listen, this was not just a basement. This was an entire network of tunnels branching out from his home for 20 meters in various directions. Some caverns stood 8 meters high. He dug passages beneath his neighbors' homes, under the roadway, and beneath the sidewalks. He carried dirt out in buckets at night so no one would see. Tons of earth, thousands of buckets. Do you know what's the wildest part? For decades, neighbors heard an odd rumble. Sometimes their dishes would vibrate in the cabinets, and cracks would appear in the walls. Yet, William would always smile sweetly and say, "Oh, it's just the old pipes, dear, don't worry." And they believed him, because he was their quiet old man from house number 121. The truth only surfaced in 2006. Imagine the absurdity. The pavement on his street began to simply collapse. Electricians came to repair a cable and discovered an emptiness beneath the asphalt, a massive black hole. When the authorities entered William's home, they were stunned. It wasn't a house. It was a shell hanging over an abyss. The man had excavated so much earth beneath him that the house was literally resting on a couple of old beams in good faith. 33 tons of waste and dirt were removed from under the house. William was evicted. The authorities filled his tunnels with concrete, spending hundreds of thousands of pounds in the process. He was nicknamed the Mole Man. Do you think he ever regretted it? Not at all. When journalists asked him, "Why, William? Why did you do this?" he would merely shrug and reply, "I just like digging. Digging is so fascinating. You never know what you'll find around the next corner." Do you know what's the saddest part of this story? William was relocated to a regular apartment in a high-rise building on the 4th floor. Imagine his state. A man who had spent 40 years enveloped by the earth was confined in a concrete box high above it. He passed away a few years later. They say he would sit for hours by the window, looking down at the sidewalk, as if trying to gaze a hole through that hated solid surface. This is a story about the universe that can exist within each of us, a universe the world is often unaware of. And sometimes, that universe requires a shovel and 40 years of silence. By the way, if you think hiding from the world underground is the pinnacle of human oddity, get ready. In the next chapter, we will explore the story of a man who also created his own world, but not from earth and stone, rather from the words of others. This is a tale of the greatest deception that began with a single letter and culminated in an entire nation believing in the existence of something that had never existed. This is story number 24, The Stone Age on Schedule. Let me ask you, do you believe in purity? No, I am not referring to relieved routines. I am talking about the purity of the human soul, that primal state in which a person was still unaware of greed, deceit, or war. Frankly, during the 70s of the 20th century, the world, weary from nuclear threats and corrupt politics, was gasping for the chance to rediscover this lost humanity. And, as is often the case when demand exceeds supply, reality conveniently handed us a fairy tale. Picture this, 1971, the Philippines, Mindanao Island. Dense, impenetrable jungles where the trees close in overhead, casting the day in perpetual twilight. Emerging from those jungles is a man named Manuel Elizalde. He is not just an official, he is a close friend of dictator Marcos, and he announces to the world, "I have found them, the Tasadai." This was sensational news that left scientists trembling. Imagine a tribe of 24 individuals living in caves. They are unaware of agriculture, they know nothing of metals, they have no fabric. They dress in loincloths made from orchid leaves and survive on roots and crabs. But the most astonishing, the most beautiful aspect was in their language. The Tasadai had no words for concepts like enemy, war, or hatred. Do you understand? A whole people stuck in the Stone Age who preserved angelic kindness within themselves. The world went crazy. Photos of the Tasadai graced the cover of National Geographic. Documentaries were made about them. Anthropologists and celebrities flew in by helicopter. Lindbergh, the famous aviator, wept at their simplicity. Manuel Elizalde became a national hero, the defender of these fragile children of nature. He achieved the declaration of a vast jungle territory as a nature reserve. Entry was strictly forbidden, only through him, only with his permission. 15 years of silence. For 15 years, the Tasadai lived in their stone paradise, cut off from the dirty outside world. Now, prepare yourselves. It is 1986. Marcos's regime collapses. Elizalde vanishes from the country, reportedly taking millions from the tribe's protection fund, and two journalists, a Swiss and a German, decide to infiltrate that very reserve without permission, risking everything. They trekked through the jungle for several days. They discovered those same caves. And what did they see? Imagine their shock. The very people of the Stone Age, who posed for cameras in orchid leaves 15 years ago, were now wearing jeans and t-shirts. They lived in ordinary huts. They were cultivating the land, and, most interestingly, they spoke excellent local dialects, although it had previously been claimed that their language was unique. This was a colossal, grand deception. One of the Tasadai later confessed. Elizalde told us that if we acted like savages, he would give us money, protect us from loggers, and make us famous. He ordered us to take off our clothing and crawl into the caves when helicopters with white people arrived. Do you understand? This entire paradise on Earth was merely a facade, a script penned by a cunning politician to gain control over earthly and budgetary finances. Listen, the scientific community was crushed. Scholars who had written dissertations on people without hatred were now looking away. It became the loudest anthropological scandal of the century. It turned out that we wanted to locate the ideal so much that we inadvertently helped fabricate it. We bought tickets to a show where the actors were poor farmers and the director was the cynical merchant. You know what's the saddest part of this story? The Tasadatas actually existed as a distinct group. They just were not people from the Paleolithic era. They were ordinary individuals forced to play the roles of themselves, but with an age 10,000 years older. This is a tale of how effortlessly words can create an entire universe if the listener truly wants to believe in it. By the way, if you think pretending to be a savage is the peak of artistry, just wait. In the next chapter, we will discuss a man who decided to pretend to be an entire army. And no, it's not about inflatable tanks. This is the story of how a single voice and one musical instrument managed to halt an advance that even generals were fleeing. Story number 25. The Symphony of Silence at the Edge of the Abyss. Listen, have you ever pondered that silence can be louder than 1,000 drums? We are accustomed to thinking that war is the racket of explosions and the clatter of steel. But imagine a moment when the fate of an entire empire rested on a single note plucked from the string of an ancient musical instrument. Honestly, this story sounds like the script for the most intense thriller. Yet it occurred in 228 AD during the Three Kingdoms period in ancient China. Envision the city of Jicheng. Dust and exhausting heat. Inside the city, there were almost no people. The great commander and strategist Zhuge Liang found himself trapped. He had merely 5,000 warriors at his disposal. Half of them were supply workers, elderly men, and boys. And at the city gates was the army of Wei, 150,000 battle-hardened fighters. 150,000 under the command of Sima, a man who showed no mercy, and most importantly, was incredibly clever. The situation was desperate. Anyone else in Zhuge Liang's position would have either fled or led the remnants of his troops to a shameful death. But he decided to play a game that would later be called the strategy of empty gates. Listen, it was beyond madness. Zhuge Liang ordered all 4 city gates thrown wide open. He instructed his few soldiers to change into civilian clothing and commanded them to simply sweep the streets before the gates. Imagine that. The enemy at the doorstep, while people in robes lazily brushed away dust with brooms. Meanwhile, Zhuge Liang donned ornate silk robes and a tall hat, climbed the city wall, positioned a pipa before him, lit incense, and began to play. Visualize this scene. 1,700 years ago, dusty Mariva in the desert. The massive Wei army froze just a few hundred meters from the city. Sima, atop his horse, gazed intently at the wall. He spots his primary adversary. The latter is sitting alone, unarmed and unprotected. His fingers gently glide across the strings. A calm, elevated melody resonates, while below him the gates are flung open and people are merely sweeping the streets. Silence. Only the strumming of the strings. Sima stands frozen. He recognized Zhuge as a cautious and calculating strategist. He suspected it was a trap. It couldn't be this simple. Within the city, in those empty houses, an ambush is lurking. He wants me to enter, and then death will rain down upon us. He listened to the music. They say he tried to find even a single false note, any sign of fear, but the melody was flawless. And do you know what happened? Sima, the great general with his massive army, commanded an immediate retreat. He turned his 150,000 warriors around and left, fearing an invisible threat. He lost a battle to one man armed only with a piece of wood strung with strings. Zhuge simply watched them depart. He understood that his reputation was his strongest armor. He achieved victory not through a sword, but through the image he crafted in his opponent's mind. This was a triumph of psychology over brute force, complete and absolute. By the way, when he was later asked how he dared to take such a risk, he responded that it was the only way to survive. He wagered everything on the notion that the enemy deemed him too clever to be defenseless. But if you believe that defeating an army with music is the pinnacle of human ingenuity, just wait. In the next story, we will shift to a place where people faced an enemy who knows no fear, doesn't heed music, and cannot be deceived. It's a tale about how a single small detail found in the ground made people believe they had discovered an entrance to hell, and they chose to venture inside. Story number 26, Fragile Majesty in an Iron Corset. Listen, have you ever felt, let's say, out of place? It happens. You wake up and everything around seems too sharp, too loud. But imagine a person who, one morning, awakens and seriously realizes that they are no longer made of flesh and blood, but are instead crafted from the finest, most fragile Venetian glass. One misstep, one too tight hug, or even a sudden gust of wind, and they would shatter into thousands of sparkling fragments. Quite frankly, that sounds absurd. But when this absurdity takes root in the mind of the most powerful individual in Europe, the life of an entire kingdom morphs into a surreal nightmare. Picture France at the end of the 10th century. The year? An era of knights, Gothic cathedrals, and endless wars. King Charles VI, whom the people initially called the Beloved, was young, handsome, and full of vigor. However, that summer proved to be extraordinarily hot. The sun literally melted the armor. The king was riding through the Lehman forest at the helm of his army. Silence. Only the clanking of the bits and the rustling of leaves. And suddenly, a mad, ragged man burst forth from the thicket, seized the reins of the royal horse and shouted, "Stop, king! You have been betrayed!" Listen, this was the moment when reality began to crack. Charles VI seemed to have fallen into an abyss. He drew his sword and began attacking his own knights. He killed 4 of his men before he could be brought down to the ground. When he regained consciousness, he had transformed into a different person. His mind resembled a shattered mirror. But the strangest events were yet to come. Imagine life in the royal palace after that. Silence. Judges moved on tiptoe. Why? Because the king was convinced he was made of glass. This condition was known as glass delusion. And no, it wasn't a metaphor. Charles VI forbade anyone from touching him, not a single handshake or hug. If someone accidentally brushed against his sleeve, the king experienced indescribable terror, fearing that his arm would fall off and shatter against the stone floor. Do you know what he did to protect himself? He ordered specially designed clothing. Underneath luxurious silk robes, he wore iron hoops and corsets. Picture it, the King of France, encased in iron to avoid breaking while walking. He refused to sit on chairs, fearing his pelvic bone would shatter. He He spent days standing or lying on soft cushions, wrapped in dozens of blankets. But wait, do you think that's all? Occasionally, he forgot who he was. He ran through the palace corridors until he collapsed from exhaustion, claiming that wolves were chasing him. He stopped bathing for 5 months. 5 long months without changing clothes or touching water. Parasites infested him. His skin erupted with sores, yet he screamed that water would dissolve his fragile body. Listen, this continued for 30 years. For 30 years, France was governed by a man who feared his own shadow and believed he was a vessel. His wife, Isabella of Bavaria, eventually took a lover and ruled the country on her own. Meanwhile, the king wandered through dark halls, whispering prayers and straining to hear the ringing in his head. Do you know what's most amusing? This glass delusion later became a genuine epidemic among European aristocracy. Hundreds of people in the 15th and 16th centuries began to believe in the same thing. It was some form of collective psychosis born from fear of a world that had become overwhelmingly complex. Charles VI passed away in the year 1442. Did he shatter? No, he simply faded away, leaving behind a country ravaged by wars and his own madness. This tale speaks to the truth that the strongest prison is not the one built from stone and bars, but rather the one created by our own minds from fragile fantasies. By the way, if you think believing in your own glass-like nature is the height of peculiarity, just wait. In the next chapter, we will discuss a man who did not only believe in something strange, but also challenged the very nature of time to save what had already been lost. It is a story about how a single miscalculation led an entire nation to vanish right before the astonished crowd. Story number 27. The man who gifted the world silence to save it from noise. Have you ever pondered how noisy our world is? Not just loud, but profoundly overloaded. Advertisements, car honks, an endless stream of news pouring into our ears, preventing us from simply thinking. To be honest, sometimes I wish I could find a button that would turn off all this chaos for at least 5 minutes. But imagine a person who not only dreamed of such a button, but decided to gift it to all of humanity. And no, this is not a story about earplugs. Picture a world in flames. The beginning of the 20th century. Machine guns have been invented, and chemical weapons have emerged. The world was bracing for a great slaughter. One of the primary instruments of this slaughter was set to be airplanes, bombers. They flew low, dropping their deadly cargo and vanishing into the clouds, leaving behind ruins and a silence more terrifying than any scream. At this moment, he steps onto the scene. Max Jimino, a French scientist and physicist who believed that science could not only kill but also save. He was obsessed with sound. It was 1938. Paris. Europe stood on the brink of the Second World War, and Max Giminos proposed something incredible to the French government. I can create a weapon that will make our cities invisible to enemy aircraft. Not visually, but acoustically. Listen, this was a revolutionary idea. At that time, radar did not exist. Bombers located their targets by sound. On rooftops, enormous acoustic locators stood, gigantic ears that captured the roar of engines from miles away. Max figured that if he could muffle the sound, he could render the city a ghost. He began his experiments. Imagine this scene: a vast hangar housing an aircraft engine, roaring so loudly that people's eardrums could burst, while Max sets up his sound attenuators. These were intricate devices generating sound at the same frequency as the engine, but in the opposite phase, you see? 2 sound waves collided and simply annihilated each other. They transformed into silence. This was magic, real physical magic. The military was thrilled. They envisioned Paris above which enemy planes flew blind, hearing not a single sound from the ground. Max was allocated substantial funds and secret laboratories. He was on the brink of a monumental discovery. But now, wait, 1940 rolls around. France capitulates. The Germans enter Paris. Max Giminos realizes that his invention is about to fall into enemy hands. And what does he do? He doesn't flee. He doesn't sell his blueprints. He burns everything, every sheet, every calculation, every schematic. He erases from history his greatest creation. But do you know what's most astonishing? The idea did not die. Decades passed, the world changed, and suddenly, by the end of the 20th century, engineers rediscovered what Max Caminos had developed back in the 30s. Today, this technology is known as active noise cancellation. It resides in your headphones, it's in pilot cabins. It protects your hearing from the roar of engines, allowing you to listen to music in complete silence while flying at an altitude of 10,000 meters. Every time you don your headphones and press the noise-canceling button, unknowingly, you are utilizing the legacy of a man who sought to save an entire city, ultimately gifting each of us a little piece of personal silence amid this mad world. Max Jiminos passed away in obscurity. His name has nearly faded from memory, yet his concept resonates in the ears of millions every day. To be more precise, it doesn't resonate, and therein lies its true magnificence. By the way, if you think creating silence is the zenith of scientific genius, hold on. In the following chapter, we will delve into how a singular mistake made on paper led people to believe they had discovered an entrance to another world. This is the tale of a map that led nowhere, and of those who chose to pursue it until the very end. Story number 28. The horizon that deceived an entire century. Have you ever pondered how much we place our trust in paper? Imagine this. You open a map on your phone, or an atlas laid out before you. You don't question the representation of a mountain, believing it truly exists there. Solid, rocky, eternal. We tend to trust the printed word more than our own eyes. But picture a scenario where the greatest scientists, geographers, and even entire armies believed for 100 years in the existence of a massive mountain range that simply did not exist. Not a single pebble. Honestly, it sounds like a grand joke, yet in the 15th and 19th centuries, it was an officially accepted truth, one people would vouch for with their heads. Imagine London in the year 1798. The rooms of the African Association are filled with the scent of fine tobacco and aged leather. The geographer James Rennell, a name then spoken with reverence, sits amidst the reports of traveler Mungo Park. Park returned from Africa and recounted seeing certain highlands. At that moment, Rennell's imagination took flight. He needed to explain why rivers flowed in West Africa in the way they did. In his mind, the ideal image called for a formidable watershed, and so he drew one. Taking a pen, he dipped it in ink and traced a long, majestic line across the continent, from Guinea all the way to Ethiopia. Mountain ranges. He named them the Congo Mountains. Imagine the scale of it all. 3,000 kilometers of rock and snow. A colossal wall separating the coastline from the mysterious heart of Africa. This was astonishing. From that moment on, the Congo Mountains became a reality. They appeared on every map around the globe. Teachers in schools compelled children to memorize their heights. Poets wrote about the eternal ice of the Congo. Merchants plotted their routes, circumventing these non-existent peaks. Even military leaders planned campaigns based on this impenetrable barrier. But do you know what's the wildest part of this story? The travelers. Throughout the 19th century, dozens ventured deep into Africa, many of whom corroborated the existence of those mountains. Just think about that level of self-suggestion. A person walks across a plain as flat as a table, sees a mist up ahead, or a range of ordinary hills, and writes in their journal, "Today we reached the majestic foothills of the Congo. The peaks are shrouded in clouds." They perceived what the maps instructed them to see. It was a collective hypnosis lasting 90 years. The truth only emerged in 1889. French officer and explorer Louis-Gustave Binger embarked on an expedition. He was a meticulous individual. He journeyed directly to where the highest peaks were depicted on the Rennell map. Picture his face. He marched for 1 day, 2 days, a week. Beneath him lay dry grass and sand. The horizon was barren. He inquired of the locals, "Where are your great mountains, the ones that touch the sky?" They gazed at him as if he were insane and replied, "White man, there is nothing here but wind." Bencher traversed the entirety of the Kong Mountains. He proved that 3,000 kilometers of rock was merely an ink blot in the mind of one London professor. You understand, for an entire century, humanity believed in a geographical phantom. When the maps were corrected, it caused a scandal. Reputations crumbled. Atlas publishers incurred massive losses. The Kong Mountains were simply erased, as if they had never existed. Yet this case remains in history as a profound reminder that even the most authoritative document can lie if the author is eager to tailor reality to fit their attractive theory. By the way, if you believe that fabricating mountains is the pinnacle of human audacity, just wait. In the next chapter, we will discuss a man who decided not to create, but to claim time itself. A story about how several days just vanished from the calendar, and about people who woke up 2 weeks older than they were the day before. Story number 29, February 30 and Stolen Time. Have you ever felt like time just slips through your fingers? You might wake up on a Tuesday, and before you know it, it's already Thursday. But imagine an entire country that one morning awoke to realize it was living in a day that officially does not exist at all. Not in any calendar in the world, nor in any church book. A phantom day. A day that is an error. Frankly, we are accustomed to thinking of the calendar as something immutable. Well, with 365 days, sometimes a leap year, mathematics validated over centuries. However, at the beginning of the 16th century, Sweden decided it was smarter than everyone else. They resolved to trick time itself. Imagine Stockholm, 1700, with a cold wind blowing in from the sea, the scent of tar and freshly baked bread filling the air. King Charles XI, young, ambitious, and, to be honest, a great lover of order, decided it was time to transition from the old Julian calendar to the new Gregorian one. The rest of Europe had already made the switch, while the Swedes were still lagging behind by 11 days. But here's where it got peculiar. Instead of simply discarding those 11 days as everyone else had done, the Swedes opted for a gradual transition. Listen, this was a brilliant yet utterly foolish idea. They decided to skip leap years over a span of 40 years. One missed day every 4 years, and voila, the calendar would align itself after 40 years. No confusion, no lost wages, pure harmony. But wait, life always adds its own twists. The Great Northern War commenced. The sound of cannon fire, chaos, and endless campaigns. The king had a few more pressing matters than the calendar. In 1704, they forgot to cancel the leap day. In 1708, they forgot again. Sweden found itself in an administrative mess. They had their own Swedish calendar, which did not match with anyone else in the world. They were 10 days behind Europe and 1 day ahead of the old style. Imagine the chaos in trade, diplomacy, and correspondence. By the year 1712, Charles XI realized, that's it, enough. The experiment has failed. We've tangled ourselves in the complexities of our own time. He ordered a return to the old style. However, to revert, they needed to add 1 extra day. And this is where what would cause a heart attack to modern accountants occurred. In February 1712, the Swedes added not 1 extra day to the calendar, but 2. Listen, this was the only time in world history when official documents, church records, and promissory notes featured it. The 30th of February. Picture this day, a Friday. People wake up and realize that today marks a date that doesn't exist, a ghost day. Some children were born on the 30th of February. Can you imagine how they later celebrated their birthdays? When's your birthday? Never. History devoured my day. It was a moment of collective surrealism. Sweden existed in this day for exactly 24 hours before safely returning to the old style, only to switch to the European calendar, but in the conventional manner, 50 years later. Do you know what's the most amusing aspect of this story? This tiny episode with the 30th of February is the best evidence that time is merely an agreement among people. We create the rules of the game, and sometimes those rules lead to a reality where a small window opens, allowing a glimpse into something entirely impossible. By the way, if you think that getting lost in the calendar is the pinnacle of human confusion, brace yourself. Our final tale is a conclusion that ties everything together. We will venture to a place where someone decided to create not just a single day, but an entire eternity, locked within a small object. An object meant to outlive humanity, yet ultimately became its primary witness. Story number 30. A voice that pierced the silence after a century and a half. Have you ever considered what will remain of us? I mean truly, not photographs stored in the cloud that will vanish in a couple of decades, nor lines on social networks. I am referring to something more intimate, the sound of your voice. Picture a person who made the greatest discovery in human history, granting us the ability to hear the past, yet never realized it himself. He died believing his life was a futile waste of time. Honestly, this story possesses the most poignant conclusion I could find for you. Imagine Paris, the 9th of April, 1860. 17 years before Thomas Edison would unveil his phonograph, a man named Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville sat in a small smoky room. He was not a scientist. He was a typographer, a proofreader, a person who had spent his life dealing with letters and words on paper. But he was obsessed with one idea. He wanted to record sound just as we record words. Listen, this was madness for that era. He did not attempt to reproduce the sound. Hold on, this is crucial. He didn't even consider it could be possible. He simply wished to see it. Martinville constructed a peculiar device, the phonautograph. Imagine a large horn, resembling a funnel. At the narrow end, there is a membrane made of pigskin, with a fine needle crafted from boar bristles. This needle grazed a glass cylinder, coated with a thick layer of soot from a standard oil lamp. On the 9th of April in 1860, during the silence of Parisian twilight, Martinville took a deep breath and began to sing into this horn. Au clair de la lune, an old French tune. His voice caused the membrane to vibrate. The needle scratched the soot, creating a faint, barely noticeable wavy line on the cylinder. The sound had become a drawing, a shadow of his voice, frozen in the grime. Martinville looked at this piece of paper and sighed. He hoped that one day people would learn to read these lines with their eyes like regular text. But no one ever learned. His invention was deemed a whimsical yet pointless toy. He passed away in poverty and obscurity, never hearing his own voice from an outside perspective. Now, prepare yourselves. 148 years have gone by. The year 2008. A laboratory in California. A group of acoustic scientists discovers in Parisian archives those very sooty papers of Martinville. They were fragile and black. It seemed that with a mere breath they would disintegrate into dust. Yet the scientists achieved something extraordinary. They scanned those lines at ultra-high resolution. They transformed the soot drawing into a digital model, and they pressed play. Listen, it was shocking. From the speakers of modern computers, through the hissing and crackling of 1.5 centuries, a voice emerged, very soft, trembling, as if a ghost was trying to speak from another galaxy. It was the voice of Martinville himself, singing his tune in cold Paris in 1860. He sang for us, unaware that we would hear him. This is the oldest recording of the human voice in history. Martinville tricked death. He preserved a piece of his soul in the layer of lamp soot, and it waited for almost a century and a half for its moment. Do you know what is the most touching part of this? We are accustomed to chasing instant results. We need likes, shares, recognition right now. Yet this man simply did what he believed in without hoping for triumph, and in the end, he conquered time itself. That's all. Our archive is closed for today. We have traveled through 30 chapters, through 30 lives filled with madness, heroism, and oddities. Remember, reality is far more bizarre than any fiction. It does not adhere to the laws of logic, it simply happens. Write down which of these stories made your heart race. And by the way, listen to the silence. Sometimes, within it, one can hear much more than in the loudest scream. Cherish your voices. Perhaps someone will hear them in 148 years.